So last week or last episode, we basically covered finding the light, backlighting, exposure control, using reflectors, color balance, and shaping and control in the actual light itself. Tonight is very similar in some ways, but it's going through a lot more imagery instead of the technique with it. So I would say to you that if you're needing to refresh or you didn't watch the last episode, continue through tonight, but then actually go back and actually see all the technique and how we explained it a little bit more in depth last session. So I've got to remind you first of kind of my saying that I kind of created many moons ago, which is natural light before reflector, reflector before flash, and then flash as a last resort. It doesn't mean that flash is not my desired choice of weapon with light, as it were, but it means that often the flash itself, because of its technology, will either be used badly or it will be used slowly when you you get going. And if I can show you how to use the natural light in the location to its best, and then you can mimic it in the same way with flash, it will absolutely categorically change the whole way that you look and use and see light within your photography on a day-to-day basis. So in this section today, we're going to be looking at the session. We're looking at diffusing the light. We're looking at reflecting the light for creative effect, harsh lighting in a session, and overpowering the ambient. Now, there is some nudity in here tonight, so good news is it's not me and Jay, but there are some nude images. So please, if you're under 18, member, whip off and get just permission to continue to actually watch. So the first thing to actually kind of just reiterate is that I work completely with a meter. The only time I don't use a light meter is when I'm on holiday and I've got my little kind of compact or my Fuji or my iPhone, where obviously with the iPhone I even use a control of metering where I'm touching the screen to say this is what I want you to expose for. And obviously with my Fuji, just getting to know it, and obviously I'll take a photograph, look on the back of the camera like so many of you do, and then kind of assess it from there. But again, really in the professional world, I need to take an exposure once, know it's correct, and basically move on from there. One thing to remind you, if we're looking at the images on the left-hand side, the three images of the Sekonic L308S, that's the entry-level light meter by Sekonic. Remember, it's just like a lens. It'll be with you for life, even if you never turn pro. But the one thing to remember is that the sensor in the bottom picture should never be revealed. So that little dome or the flat disc has to be attached to cover that sensor every single time. It's still a problem that I see when I see some photographers come on workshops and everything else with it. And don't worry if you come in on one of the fine art workshops with me or some of the other tuition that I do. I kind of always take it from the basic upwards to the most creative, and I try and work one-on-one with you during the day to actually really push your technique and so on. So as far as the metering is concerned, that's the first thing. Then as far as the reflectors are concerned, obviously it's in the name, reflector. So if we want to cut out light, we basically use a subtractor. Now, some reflectors, to do with their thickness, can be also used as a subtractor of light, so held above them. But a reflector is basically being used to actually push the light from one position to another. Whereas a diffuser is basically being used between the light source and the actual subject to take the harshness off the light. Now, today we're talking a lot about harsh light anyway, so probably if you've got a diffuser already and you've got a reflector, you'll know how to actually mix the two together. I'm not bothered whether it's a fixed tri-grip like you're seeing on the left-hand side, or it's one of the tri-grip which has the multi covers, but probably you're going to be using two reflectors at kind of a more advanced level. So never be never be afraid to actually invest into at least one solid, in other words, either a diffuser or a reflector. Okay. The session. So I basically chose a commercial shoot, because this is really where I've got no room for maneuvement at all. I've got to make sure I absolutely deliver quality. Now, I chose a bridal shoot. So this is a bridal designer called Blue, and basically I've shot for her since the late 80s, and originally introduced to me by one of her brides, and basically she loved the way I photographed her dress, and that's how I basically got involved with her, not because of my commercial training, but because of one of her brides and things really. Now, Angela always loves to work with locations and work outside the majority of the time. Hardly ever have we ever photographed in studio. So it means the mastery of light is absolutely essential for me to make sure I'm not losing the valuable details. Now, if you go back to the late 80s, when I first began to shoot with her, everything was being shot on film. So I had to make sure that all the detail was there. I suppose in some ways we were lucky that in the early days, for probably the first 5 or 6 years, she only ever commissioned black and white photography, but then she actually soon moved into color photography, and then obviously when I moved into digital, she came along for the ride. And in fact, when I moved into digital, her costings began to fall through the floor as far as all the proofing of contact sheets and so on. For a while she was already hooked into contact sheets, and even with digital she was still paying for them, but then she soon weaned herself off them by actually being able to view on a big screen and so on. So when we're using natural light, I'm usually looking for diffused light, or light that I can manipulate to actually redirect it to actually add for a bit of a kick. Now, remember the angle of reflectancy, which means that when the light hits a surface and it's reflectant, it will increase its brightness by up to twice the amount. By doing that, it means when the sun is high, or the light is from above and it hits a angled surface like a wedding dress, it will then increase the brightness of the exposure of that dress by around about a stop to 2 stops, depends on the intensity, which means if I'm exposing for the face, which we do, basically the dress is more than likely going to be slightly overexposed. So in the commercial world, of course, we're exposing for the product, i.e. the dress, rather than the face, but usually I'm going to choose a location where they pretty much both marry together. So on this particular day, again, lucky to some resort, because basically it's a dullish day. So the light from above is kind of working itself. I don't really have to work much. But with the dullish day, all of a sudden a bit of sun comes out. It can completely change an image from the left-hand side to the right-hand side without you even realizing. And obviously what you've got to be aware of is the increase in the intensity of the light. Now, one of the reasons that I meter by hand all the time is that if you're looking at this image in front of us with so much light, but then a dark door, if I was using an automatic exposure in camera, as I zoomed closer in and out of the image, the exposure would change each time, which obviously would be bad if it was being shot in the likes of transparency. That's why everything that we did was fixed in manual exposure. But it's also bad even in the digital world, because it means that if I'm automatically exposing on camera instead of fixing the exposure, pretty much every one of the images are going to be slightly different in some way, and that's what we don't want to do, is lose that valuable detail in the highlight. Of course, when we start to move locations, then we'll start going to have more of a reflected light kicking off the material to increase the brightness within elements. So when we're choosing the locations, we've got to look at actually the consistency of the light for around about 15 to 20 minutes when we're photographing perhaps just that one dress itself. When we've got a day and then all of a sudden the sun really burns through, obviously there's going to be a dramatic difference in the style and the quality of the lighting as well. So when we're looking for locations, we're obviously aware that on a day where the light goes in and out, the same location is going to drastically change. So we need to be able to identify the right locations to shoot with, so we can move if we have to, just 10, 20 feet away from the main location to get a different style and look and things really. So even though she's leaning against the house door here, I've had to move her pretty much straight away now. It's a Lighthouse door, it is. I've had to move her away from there actually into the little bit more of the shield back of the actual kind of little hut. And then, of course, what I've got to try and do is balance out the quality of the light across the whole shoot. And this is where we start to use reflectors and diffusers. Diffusers to just subtract some of the sun, and reflectors to add more of the light. So in other words, the image on the right hand side is the perfect timing, diffused light and so on, whereas the image on the left hand side, we're kicking in a little bit of reflected light when the sun comes out, because we're in the kind of complete shade and we need to actually kick it in just a little bit more. So by using a reflector just off to the left hand side, most of the time held above head height and then angled down towards the subject to create more of a direction to the light, similar that we'd use flash, we start to really bring a three-dimensional look and feel to the image. So in the next image, you can see here where the dress designer, she's basically on the floor just pulling all the dress down, and even though we iron out, or she irons out on the day, there's always kind of a position that I put them in, a slight leg position move, and all of a sudden there's some creases that come into the dresses and so on. And when we're kind of photographing the same dress with and without jackets, with and without boleros, with and without sleeves and so on, it's going to look very, very similar, not catalogue style, but what we need to do is have that consistency of the light. Now, in the same way, when we're using daylight out on location, it's similar when we're using the window light, because it's basically a guaranteed consistency of light. And even when the light drops outside, all I've really got to do is change my ISO to actually bring the quality back up. That is, of course, unless the window is completely sunlit. But the window light gives a direction, gives a controlled aperture, and subtracts all the other light away from the scene. And it's a quick way for us to kind of feature straight in towards the article. So if you're a wedding photographer at this stage, you're learning some key techniques in allowing you to move away from flash photography into natural light photography. So both of these images, though, have a slight added reflector just in place to bring detail up of the shadow information. So the right-hand image, where we're seeing all the buttons coming down the back, there's a slight white reflector at around about 10 feet, which enables it to actually just pick a little bit of the detail up so it doesn't go very, very dark. And they're very, very similar then with the image on the left-hand side, where the body is turned towards us. Obviously, we're using that reflector just to kind of pick up the detail panel running down the side of the left breast and down the left hip. So control is the key thing. Then when we start to move the subject into the room, so further away from the light, she's now on the image on the left-hand side, she's about 15 feet or 12 feet away from the light source. By the time I've done that, the quality of the light has absolutely diminished to nothing, which means that I've subtracted the light so much. It's like being in a wood and walking too far into the wood and trying to use the natural light that was coming through the opening of the trees as we walked into the wood itself. By this stage, the subtraction from the window, which is quite small, the angle of the light, which would be now, as you can see, hitting more towards the knee and the floor rather than the face. We've got to use a reflector lower down to kick some of the lighting back up again in towards the face. But the light source, the reflector, is now still by the window. It's not in the room, it's by the window. And there's times where we're using two reflectors to angle them onto each other. So in other words, a big silver reflector by the window reflected to hit a big white reflector near subject to increase or soften the detail as we need to. And then, of course, we're in the top of the lighthouse then, and then because we've got all the light coming in from behind, and even though you might think that there is a window completely behind us as well, it's not. It's a kind of a shuttered off effect. So it means that I need to actually reflect some more of the lighting into the dress to make sure we've got the detail and I don't burn fully out the horizon in the background. So reflectors are absolutely a photographer's best friend if you're using them in the right way. If you leave a reflector behind, I promise you'll be kicking yourself when you get to the scene and you think, I need to actually kick a little bit more light into the face, into the dress, into the body and the design. And even at times, kicking reflections into the likes of some of the elements within the scene, which could be when you're working within a hotel and you're trying to light the food up perhaps, as well as the subjects. So it's all about balancing. Any questions on that so far, Jay?
Question. Well, the first question we had was if you could just repeat the angle of the reflector, but you did it as the question came in, so you caught that one. The other question that I have for you at the moment is with the natural light and the reflection, where are we actually metering for?
Okay, so in the commercial, I'm metering from an average between the face and the dress. Okay, so I'm using the dome to actually create it, whereas usually in a commercial photography, I'd be metering with the dome kind of turned in, so it becomes more of a flat and more of a complete exposure, an accurate exposure instead of an average exposure. So when you're using your meter, especially when you're kind of getting going within your control of light and exposure of light, have the dome out, and that will take an average of both the shadow side and actually the sunlight itself, and it'll help you maintain the detail throughout. But usually from the face towards the light source.
And that's with the reflector in place already, isn't it?
In place already. Obviously, if you meter without the reflector in place, as you add the reflector in, it's going to increase its brightness, and then you need to re-meter. Otherwise, you're going to overexpose the image.
When do you choose between the silver or the white of the reflector?
Okay, so because we live in the UK, by design, our light is usually softer than when we're photographing in the likes of other parts of Europe, like Spain or Portugal, Italy, and so on. So when shooting in very, very bright sunlight, which we'll see now in a minute, in fact, we tend to actually use the white reflector more, so we're softening the light return. That is unless, of course, we've put the subject into a darkened area, or we're really having to lift the highlight information throughout the whole image by reflecting more of the strong sunlight over all the image. So by design, in UK, we tend to use a silver or a sunlight reflector. A sunlight refers to white and gold stripe on the reflector instead of being white or silver. There's also a soft silver, which is basically a white thread and a silver thread in one. I very rarely use just a harsh silver reflector unless I'm working in the studio, in fact, because that's almost mirror-like.
Brill. There was a shot where the subject was deep in the room. So the question was, would you be shooting on a tripod, or are you likely to be up in your ISO?
I should be. Okay, so with Angela, we're going to see another one of her shoots now in a minute. Basically, I've got to shoot about 22 dresses in a day. It would be absolute. So the average commercial photographer would shoot 6 in a day rate, but she only has so much budget to do it with. So I've got to shoot 22 gowns in a day. Now, some of those gowns might have a change of jacket, belt, lace, kind of a real combination. So I might be photographing, let's say, around about 12 different gowns, but then there would be at least 10 accessories on top, at least. And to do that within a working day, we're pretty much on site from around about 8 o'clock, 8:15. Makeup takes around about an hour and a half then, or an hour. In that time, we've unpacked, we've basically scouted locations, decided where we're going to shoot, and then obviously we can track the light and actually make sure we're in a location by a particular time of day with the right gown. I'm not sure if that's a bit too in depth of what we just went through then. But I should be using a tripod, but it'd be too slow. That's how we got there.
Okay. Been asked this a couple of times, and Kate, you might have covered it though. Roughly what size is the reflector and how far away from the subject? That's been asked a couple of times, actually.
Well, the bad news is for the assistants, I carry the biggest of the biggest with me at all stage, including the light panels. But the most of the time, it's around about a meter wide at its longest length. Obviously, on very windy days, windsurfing is included in all kind of assistant training. So we might have to actually go to a smaller reflector. And that's one of the reasons that last light developed the tri grip, was so that we could have a solid hold and basically take control of one end, even in very, very fierce light, or for us to work one-handed if we didn't have an assistant with us on gentle breeze days.
And approximately how far away from the subject?
That all depends. So if we go to the next image for a minute, so what we're seeing here is a reflector being used to correct color balance. Yes. So this is in fact being clean lit on the right hand side, and we're probably around about 8 to 9 feet away.
Actually, well, the next question that I have might be answered in this series, but the question was, I often have subjects squint when I use the reflector outside. Have you experienced this and there's a way around it?
Well, not unless you get them to look at it, you donut. It's like looking into the sun. You don't look into the sun, so you don't look into the reflector. So if you're using the wrong reflector surface on the day, that's not going to help your subject at all, because it would be like throwing the sun back in their face. So that's why I said to you, don't be afraid to go for the triflector kits, the covers, so you can have the right reflector for the right day. Sorry, I shouldn't have said donut out loud then.
Well, no, it's to the point, isn't it? I suppose we never sugarcoated anything. Well, typically with the exception of donut, but to the point, I get it.
Sorry. I haven't used the word donut in ages, have I? I don't know. So anyway,
probably
I don't think I've ever used it on a webinar. Yay! Should I get on with it?
Right, get on with it. That's all of it for now.
Okay, cool. So now we're talking about diffusing the light, but we're also in the same way, we're diffusing color cast. And this is where I find it really easy to kind of show you commercial images, because we're under so much constraint. You can see these amazing beach huts behind us. This is just down the road from our studio here, in fact. And great, in black and white, no problem at all. But once you actually want to shoot some color imagery, we've got to actually correct the color, especially when you get as close to the huts as we are here, because all the light is coming in from the right hand side. That is kicking in and hitting a hut and kicking back light. So I have to make sure that not only am I using a reflector to help correct the color balance, but I'm also using a reflector to make sure I've got a white dress. Can you imagine if I hadn't used a white reflector to correct the color balance on here? You'd literally have a red dress on the left hand side and a white dress on the right hand side. She'd look like a flipping flag. So again, these are the nightmares that you have when you put yourself into a certain scenario because you think it looks good as a photograph, and then you go, oh Jesus, now I've got to put a light panel in place and things really. So remember, a lot of these shoots are on the Photographer Academy, and I definitely encourage you to go and watch them, because you're going to see again some of the commercial shoots that I've kind of been allowed to film. Basically, they're kind of short little kind of clip films instead of a training film, but you can still see where reflectors are and so on with it. So here we're using just the reflector for color balance, and you can see, whereas we're using some of the photographs with the sunglasses on, I can't do the whole shoot with them on, because otherwise the designer would have just thrown the dummy out of the pram, guaranteed, because obviously we've got to kind of give this feeling that it's visible anywhere, anytime. So we chose this location specifically because we wanted a south of France, or a kind of a little edgier and a little bit more of a sunlit kind of kissed. So again, lucky with the weather coming out a little bit, but even if the weather didn't come out, a stone's throw away from that location is this. So by subtracting her into the darkness of these pillars and cover from above, I can create this lovely hazy kind of look and feel from the actual light coming in. So if you see the huts behind her, that's not the huts that were just in the last photograph. The huts that were in the last photograph are just literally 10 feet to her left. So Here, we're not so much worried now about the color of the light, because the light is coming in from the right-hand side. We're into a deep covered cavern, so it means that there's not going to be anything to reflect it back from. So now the reflector's job is to lift the detail in the underskirt as well as along the side of the skirt. But what I have to do is give a three-dimensional look. So for instance, if I used a flash on camera and I directed it towards her, basically I wouldn't create a three-dimensional dress. I would create a flatter and fatter look. So I have to allow the natural direction to the light to create the three dimension. Then the reflector or the diffuser at times as well is being used to subtly just bounce a little bit of the light back. So I wouldn't be afraid to use the likes of a big diffuser here to bounce some of the light back on the left-hand side of her. But you know, when you look at the qualities in here, if I turn this to black and white, it would look like it's the south of France or something else. In fact, we were lucky that there was a guy cutting stone right in the distance, in fact. So that's a good 15 minutes to walk there from where we are here. And basically every time the sun came out, he began to actually cut stone, and it began to look like real kind of three-dimensional mist kind of coming through. So it was excellent. So when we start to look at diffusing the light, the first thing I want to do is turn the body away from the light. We touched on this in the last episode. But then what we want to do, as I said, is to start to maintain a good contrast to print. And this is where a lot of photographers go wrong. It's not that they don't turn the body away from the light source, some obviously do, but what we're trying to do is add some reflected light back into the scene to add that extra printable element. So if we were using flash as a fill or a contrast control, it would be most of the time filling in too much of the scene. So in other words, it would actually light the rock as well as the subject with it. And really what we're trying to do is, if we're looking close to it, is we're really trying to light just the actual face to actually keep the control. So because I've turned the body away from the light so much, obviously we're getting burning out in the detail coming in from behind. But what I've got to make sure is that I'm maintaining some of the detail on the face, otherwise everything is just going to be washed out. So when we start diffusing light, it's often turning the body away from the light source and then reflecting some light back into the subject to maintain the quality. We can also use a diffuser to subtract the light that is hitting the subject to soften the light source, as well as completely subtract the light to completely change the whole scene. That's usually done with big commercial light panels. Or we can basically just use little small reflectors, even around about a foot wide, to actually use multiples of them, one in each hand, to actually kind of pop different parts of the light. So we almost paint the light across the subject. So it doesn't matter if you're buying a small little reflector now. When you kind of start to invest into your reflector kit, you'll basically start adding in and buying the bigger versions as you go. So I wouldn't buy the Ferrari of the reflectors. You know, there was the big tri-grips for now. I'd probably go ahead with a medium. Any questions on that, Jay?
We've got lots of questions, but they're a bit all over the place now, and I can't remember if it's just on this section. Going back to the beginning of that, the bit on the pier with the beach huts, and you referred to using the reflector for color balance. Which way to use it to correct color balance? Which way are you pointing in direction for?
Okay, so basically, if the light is coming in from the right and the model is in the middle, so the light's coming in from the 3 o'clock high, then the light would be reflected off the 9 o'clock color of the actual shed, and that would bounce back in towards her. So we actually put the reflector where the color of the bounces. So we're basically turning that color into near white with either a white reflector, or at some stage we might even have to use a silver reflector, depends how far away it is. So we're actually using a white in that case to actually soften and correct the color balance back.
This came back in with that series with the beach huts. Well, it's more about the lens choice, really. I can't remember. I presume it's your standard zoom, is it? Do you think?
7200.
Oh, there we go.
7200 shooting on 200, yeah? You pretty much never shoot a commercial image without a very long telly.
And this has just come in, mate. When shooting in natural light with the sky behind you, do you use a filter or polarizer on the lens?
I don't use a filter on the lens because that can add flare by itself. If I'm going to add flare, I want to take the lens hood off so it literally hits the glass. We'll see that now in a minute, in fact. There are times when we use a polarizer, but not for the light from behind the subject, because that would just actually diffuse the light. It'll just lower the overall exposure throughout, but I've got to pump in the same amount of light back into the face of the subject no matter what. So we tend to use a polarizer when we're either trying to correct glass and the reflections in glass, or we're pointing towards a solid blue sky with fluffy white clouds. That's what we're looking at. So in other words, the sun is in the same plane as the camera perhaps, and then turning the polarizer to deepen the blue and whiten the whites.
Brilliant, mate. That's all the questions for a minute.
But can I just say, congratulations on asking a question about a filter on the front of the lens. I tend not to actually use a skylight filter ever, even though they're there to design to protect the front of the glass of the lens. Most lens hoods are designed to protect the glass of the lens as far as the light shade. When you put a filter on the front of it, it then no longer actually stops the penetration or the shielding of the sunlight or light from behind from controlling onto the glass itself. So again, I tend not to actually use a skylight filter anyway. So now we're into the reflecting light for a little bit more of a creative. So here we're on the same location with the same girl. She features quite a lot in today because I wanted to choose sessions, yeah? So this is actually one of the workshops from years ago. We're on the same location, one of my favorite locations, in fact. And basically still on the long lens, but now because of the intensity of light and my angle, so in other words where my camera is quite high and I'm quite high and I'm shooting down towards the sea, there is a lot of light bouncing naturally back into the lens. So now what I've got to do is increase the light onto her to help the exposure control the reflectancy from the sea. So in the same way as I began the session off by saying the angle of reflectancy on a surface, this is a perfect example. So where we talked about the angle of reflectancy on a wedding dress, where it basically will slightly overexpose the image unless we control it, in the same way here, because of the angle of sun coming off the water back towards camera position, unless I add a reflector or a mirror or a flash or something to help the exposure be more dominant from the front and bring some more contrast into the scene through adding in again a pure white and a dark in towards the front of the subject with it. Basically things are just going to look mushy and burnt out with it. So when we start to look in close onto the subject now, we can start to see the magic catchlight in the eye, how it's just adding that lovely little pop from the reflector running on the side. So again, if I was you, whenever you're working on location, I would try and encourage to have an assistant there of some kind to help you actually put the reflector in the right place. There is absolutely no way for me to take a reflector on the stand in this scene, because it would just be blowing down the beach as soon as I left it there. Even if I stuck my camera bag on it, it'd be blowing down the beach as we go. So with these two images, you can see the difference in the position of the reflector to the photograph. So in other words, with the image on the left-hand side, the reflector is quite flat on to the subject's face. Hence, it has this lovely Hollywood flatness, almost like a beauty dish effect. But whereas I've moved more towards the right-hand side, so I've moved closer to the original 3 o'clock position, and I'm now photographing, and the reflector has stayed in the same place. As the subject moves her face to look towards the new camera position, you can see that more increase of shadow has happened down the right-hand side, because obviously she's turning her head away from the light source. So whenever we move position, we've also got to accept that either the reflector will change the look and feel to the photograph if the subject's face is going to move, or I have to move the reflector to compensate for the new camera position. So I think these three images are a kind of a really good example in the workshop of what we were showing, is that the image in the left-hand side is a perfect use of the reflector to give almost a flashlit feel to the whole image, whereas the image in the middle is nice, safe, and it's a softer use of the reflector. So just turning the silver around to a white to soften the light source. But now the image on the right-hand side, where we're using the reflector closer to the camera, 6 o'clock position, it adds too much frontal light near to camera and losing the 3-dimension. But when we start to use a more reflective surface, this is the same girl on the same day in a boudoir scenario instead now. Now, we touched on this last week, by using a very harsh reflector of light, like a mirror, we start to really dramatically change the image. So this is the natural light coming through the studio windows, but then a sunspot is being picked up by a hand mirror. It's just around about a 6x4 in size. And then it's being hand controlled by one of the photographers or the assistants for the day to make sure it goes into a particular place. So now you can see here how just by using reflected sunlight in a small pocket way that we can create almost a near Hollywood style of cinematic light by just adding in that little bit of kind of reflected mirror. So never be afraid to really have, on sunny days, a mirror just out of sight, and basically using it to kind of add in that little bit of glint of light and things. Really can be very, very effective even when you're working inside but near a window source. Any questions, Jay?
No, we're all good at the minute, mate. Sorry.
Okay, bro. So harsh light in a session. Now, you've already seen I'm not afraid of harsh light. That's what you need to go away with from tonight, is don't worry about harsh light, okay? Just don't get the subject to look at you. That's the key thing to remember more than anything else. Believe it or not, this is natural light streaming through the big church window in our studios, but we've put a massive black background behind her. Almost looks like it's studio flashlit, but all we're using in here is a reflector to kind of add more lighting back into the image. So you can see the extreme light coming through, a black reflector behind her, basically allowing the almost the diffusion of the light hitting the tulle of the skirt and the skin to just lovely softly burn kind of through and things really, but creates a fantastic look and feel. When we start to use the strong sunlight, so we're back on location with that same girl we just saw a minute ago where we turned her back to the sun. Now we're using the actual sun itself for the main exposure. So once more, the exposure is being taken from the face towards the light source now, to create the look and the feel. So what we've got here now, as the sun begins to set in the golden hours, basically we start to get a richness and intense light, a little bit more of a sharpness to the light, a little bit more orangey glow of the light as well, but creates this lovely look and feel, and kind of gives us almost a Fresnel style of focused in sunlight soft. Kind of coming in towards the image. So as I said, if they're going to look towards the camera, if they are going to look towards the camera, and if they are going to look towards a reflector, they close the eyes, then on 3, they open it up. So it's 1, 2, 3, bang, open, boom, 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 and then we get the shots done and we're away from there. But otherwise, we've got to balance looking at the camera with looking away. Otherwise, there's going to be too much water into the eyes and you're going to lose the shoot as soon as you start. So don't be afraid of the sunlight. Use the exposure from face to sun position, and basically you'll have a consistency of exposure until the light starts to drop away fully. Anything else, Jay?
No, we're all good, minute.
Okay, so when we look at overpowering the ambient, of course, what we're really looking at is, do we have to use flash or can we use a reflector? Now, you've already seen some use of a reflector to add a kind of a definition, but when we're trying to drop the ambient down so much, we basically need to actually usually revolve to more kind of flash based and things really. I would always try and work with a light on a stick. This enables the assistant to either move it closer or further away to kind of get it either closer in as far as the exposure is concerned. But the main thing is to actually change the direction of the light. So if they know the light is going to be around about 6 to 8 feet, let's say, away from the subject, basically, as they move the extension arm of the light stand away from us, as long as it maintains its distance away from the subject, we can go from a very flat looking image to a very dynamic shaped light by not doing anything else except moving the position of the light source. By design, when we're overpowering the background with flash, or if we can with reflector, it's usually impossible, but however, what we're looking to do is overpower the ambient by at least 1 stop, or 2 as a maximum. So this will allow the background to really drop quite fierce. And this is obviously at times where we're having to use the likes of speed lights, perhaps when you haven't got enough power. I use the Elinchrom range of off-camera flash as well, and basically the ELBs allow a big whack of power compared to a speed light, so I can obviously shoot with a much bigger depth of field and things really as well if I want. But with the speed light, of course, I've got to rely on using the shutter speed to bring the ambient light down, and then actually managing how much light I've got in my pocket flash, as it were, to actually just kind of bring it alive. So even when we're working against open light and against the likes of a shutter door like you see here, the way to overpower the ambient light within the scene, as I said, is to go 1 step beyond. Then most of the ambient light visible is acting like a fill, whereas the flash is creating its specularity. So as you can see here, we've got just 1 light being used on him. Some of it is spilling onto the corrugation of the garage door just to the left-hand side, but all the detail in the fill is natural light in the ambient. So when we're looking to overpower the background, there's times where you're shooting against the sun fully. You'll never be able to really bring the sky down like we just showed with flash, but we can actually bring the contrast into the face more. So the likes of this image, where you can see how close the silver reflector is to the subject, we can start to maintain more detail in the sky, but we're having to add lighting into the face, otherwise it would just be washed out and bleached out like this image here. So even within this image, we're allowing some of the flare from both the reflector, so the lens has got a lens hood off, we're pointing the lens towards the sunlight, allowing some of the glint of the light to actually kind of add a natural flare, but we're also adding some more flare from the reflector itself to add more in towards the lens so we can use it in a dramatic way. And as we were showing before, in some way, when you're trying to overpower the ambient, if you do want it to be subtle, make sure that the background is in shadow, or more in shadow, or shade, I should say, so you can actually, from off location, so in other words, from a distance away, you can reflect the sunlight into the scene to help bring the subject alive by darkening the background at the same time. But of course, my favorite effect is using flash to dramatically change the image. These images were taken about 10 minutes apart, and it's just a shutter speed different between the two with it. So again, looking at the kind of the style that you want to achieve is key, of course. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as this. It could be as subtle as this. So the image on the left-hand side, using the sun in the top, coming straight in towards the lens, photographing at 8,000th a second, but making sure I've got enough flash power to actually light fully the fashion subject here. Whereas on the right-hand side, we're just using a reflector to add some of the light back into the skin to control and bring out the face compared to the rest of the environment. And that's it. That's our part 2 of using the ambient light, daylight and window light on location, or inside, of course. So we just covered the session, diffusing the light, reflecting the light for creative effect. harsh lighting in a session, and overpower in the ambient. Questions there, Jay?
Well, you answered. Oh, excuse me, sorry. You answered quite a lot of them as you went, and it was quite interesting. I think that this question came in just before that last section because it was the rule natural light before reflector and before flash. Don't you think that flash is better when you're trying to keep the detail in the sky? So I guess I wasn't sure when that came in, but obviously that's pretty much what you've just done, right?
Yeah, so the natural light before reflector means I don't even get the reflector out. I'm just trying to make sure I use the correct location first where possible. Often there's a location near you that you're just not looking at. And one of the great things I learned from a landscape photographer was I asked them if there was one bit of advice that you'd give to a beginner in landscape photography, what would it be? And they said, look behind you. And I thought that's absolutely flipping genius, that is, because that's exactly what I'd be saying to you when you're looking for your locations to shoot or position your subject in, whether it's for fashion or portrait. Again, it's really down to you, but looking for the location first, that's really what natural light before reflector means. Then using reflector before the flash means the flash will basically be the reflector will be a little bit more instant, less techy, and more controllable and fast. And it will allow us to actually get more variety without the kind of the setup time, even the thought process going through the head. Then, of course, flash is the last resort. Doesn't mean flash is the last resort, but flash is there to actually absolutely create magnificence. And if you're using flash for just average illuminating stuff, you've got to be aware that there's a massive difference there between using flash as illumination and using flash to light.
Brilliant, mate. We're done. All the questions are done.
Wow, excellent. Well, thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed tonight. Next session, we're going to be looking at, you've guessed it, it's shooting dance. So we're going to be looking at both studio and location, natural light and flash. We're going to be giving you some ideas on how you can basically just look at your location with different eyes, look at your studio with different eyes, and maximize the variety that you can get with a dancer in a studio or on location.